Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So welcome everyone. We're grateful that you're with us and that we are with you. I'm going to just call up so that we can refresh briefly the syllabus, kind of just a quick roadmap of where we've been. So we did an introductory session on the basic themes of the holidays, mostly as they are described in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, where the main point is what the Torah has to say about these holidays is minuscule compared to what the rabbis expand on these holidays in sharing their meaning. We talked about why that is. Again, you can go back and refer to all the YouTubes. The shofar and its meaning, both how and why we blow shofar, was the focus of our second lesson. Last week, we really concentrated on the theme of Teshuvah. Again, I really hesitate to give a standard English translation with the word repentance, because if you were paying attention last week, or if you haven't yet seen it, but go and watch the review session online, you will discover that Teshuvah is very poorly translated when we translate it as repentance. It is much more layered, nuanced, and multifaceted than simply atoning for sin. And then finally, today is kind of a roundup of themes pertaining to Yom Kippur. So we're going to talk for the first half of the class about the fasting on Yom Kippur. And then we're going to take the second half of the class to return to Teshuvah in what we hope will be kind of like a wide or an expanded lens. So that's where we're starting. We're starting with Bavli, Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Yoma, Daf 81a, paragraph 7. Conveniently, it's easy to call up online. I want to make sure that, can everyone see the text on the screen? It has some Hebrew. That's what came up because I didn't do an independent screen share. Great. Before we even look at fasting on Yom Kippur, what I would like to do is invite us to do just a quick comparison to what the Torah itself teaches us about the fast of Yom Kippur, or I should say, does not teach us about the fast of Yom Kippur. So the bulk of what the Torah has to say about Yom Kippur is found in the book of Leviticus, chapter 16. At the beginning of the chapter describes the rituals surrounding two goats that were presented to the priest for sacrificial purposes. One to be blood sacrificed, the other to convey all of the sins of the Israelite community and then to be sent off into the wilderness. In the language of the Torah itself, this goat is La'azazel, which may actually have been a demonic entity or some kind of god or demigod from Canaanite practice. What exactly Azazel means continues to elude scholars and translators. However, the basic idea seems to be that by transferring the sins of the community onto this hapless little creature and then damning the creature, the whole point is that, in fact, even today in modern Hebrew, if you want to say go to hell, you say lech la'azazel, literally go to Azazel. So Azazel is a kind of stand-in term for cursing or damning or casting out for destruction. And that's exactly what would happen to this poor little goat. Presumably, he'd wander off to its death and carrying the sins of the Israelites with it. To this day, of course, the term scapegoat comes directly from the 16th chapter of the book of Leviticus, meaning the goat that escapes. And I believe even in like the Old English or the formal English King James translations of the Bible, this goat is referred to as a scapegoat, meaning the goat that escapes. So that's the first part of the chapter. But the second part of the chapter picks up with a verse that is directly relevant to the Talmud that we're going to begin with today, and that is this verse here. So it says, this is all about the goat up until verse 28. And now picking up in verse 29, V'hayita lachem lechukat olam, this should be an eternal law for you. B'chodesh hashavi'i, in the 7th month, be'asor lachodesh, on the 10th of the month, we know that that's the day of atonement. Ti'anu et nafshotechem. Very tricky phrase to translate. Here they say, you shall practice self-denial. Better translation, more literal translation. Ti'anu et nafshotechem means you should afflict your bodies. In biblical Hebrew, the term nefesh, which is at the root of this word here, meant the body. Even though in rabbinic parlance and up to the present day, when you talk about a person's nefesh, you are actually referring to that person's not body, that person's soul, the ineffable part of humanity, not the physical, but rather the spiritual. Be that as it may, scholars agree entirely that when the word nefesh is used in the Hebrew Bible, in the biblical canon, it refers to the body. So you should afflict your bodies. And then the second part, v'chol melacha lo ta'asu, we know from the very first lesson we studied together, it's repeated in the 23rd chapter of Leviticus, do no work of any kind, ha'ezrach v'hager hagar b'tochachem, both the citizen and the stranger who resides with you. All right, so that's the gist of the Yom Kippur ritual according to Leviticus chapter 16. And I want to highlight what is said, but even more importantly, what is not said. The essence of the Yom Kippur ritual is ti'anu et nafshotechem, the words I've highlighted here. Literally, afflict your souls, afflict your bodies rather, or as translated below, practice self-denial. What is not stipulated is exactly how. And so as is the case with so much of Jewish practice, so much of rabbinic law or teaching, the specifics are actually left up to the interpretive genius of the rabbis, as opposed to the explicit words of the Torah itself. The Torah says merely this very vague thing, afflict yourselves. You can imagine the rabbinic community centuries later going, what exactly does that mean? Do I lie on a bed of nails? Do I eat foods I don't like? I mean, what do I taunt myself? No, the rabbis actually give us a direct 5-point code of conduct that equals, in their view, self-denial. Those are the 5 things that one is restricted from doing on Yom Kippur. One may not eat, drink, and we'll do a little bit of ask the audience on this one. Who knows the other restricted behaviors on Jewish fast days, including the Day of Atonement and including, for instance, Tisha B'Av? Eating and drinking, we all know. What else is not permitted on Yom Kippur? Mom and Dad, you can chime in with any one or more of the restrictions.
Sex, for sure.
Sex, for sure, right? So procreation, the use of the marital bed, euphemistically, the way the rabbis might put it, is out of the question on the Day of Atonement. Susan Esther, unmute yourself before you speak, please.
I think washing, bathing is restricted.
Correct. Good. That's another one. Arlene? Oh, unmute yourself, please.
Wearing shoes.
You're allowed to
If
wear
you're
shoes,
Orthodox.
but you're not allowed to wear certain
Like to wear
kinds of
leather.
leather shoes, which were a sign of luxury, and therefore not to wear leather was a sign of abasement, not the cellar in your house, but abasement, to abase oneself.
Right.
Good. And there's one more, which is anointing oneself. I'm going to just get rid of that, like wearing oils or perfumes or what have you. So all of these, all of them have to do with your body, by the way. That's what I want to highlight. That's another proof, as it were, that when the Torah uses the word nafshotechem, your nefesh, it really is talking about your physical embodiment. These are the way in which we afflict ourselves is not just through thought. It is through actual various kinds of not particularly harmful or consequential mortifications of the body. And even then, we know from my incessant announcements on the bima on Yom Kippur that fasting can be dangerous for people who are in frail health, who are on counterindicated medications. So this is my friendly first PSA of the season. Please don't be a martyr and fast if you're not supposed to fast. The point is not to jeopardize your health. The point is, well, that's why we're having this lesson today. I don't want to tell you what the point is, because that's exactly what we're here to learn. So let's proceed now into the Babylonian Talmud. And what I'd like to do is call up the text from Yoma. Again, Yoma Daf 81a. In the middle of the page, I'll bring it on screen for those who are using Safaria, which is, I think, every one of us. Okay, so here it says, let's look at the Mishnah first in Hebrew. Mataneh, meaning we're in the Mishnah, big bold-faced letters. It's a sign that we're back to the original rabbinic text here. The Mishnah says, "Achal v'shata behelem echad." So literally, if you ate, achal is to eat, v'shata and drink. If you ate and drank, or ate or and drank, behelem echad, literally within one lapse of awareness. In other words, if just you had what we call a brain fart, and you woke up on the morning of Yom Kippur and you poured yourself your usual orange juice and Life cereal, and you started enjoying your breakfast, and then all of a sudden realized, oh my goodness, it's Yom Kippur, I've got to put on my nice clothes and get to temple. Here is what the Talmud says are the consequences for this momentary lapse in awareness. Eino chayav ela chatat achat. You are culpable, you are liable to bring only one sin offering. In other words, even though you both ate and drank, if you did it at the same time, and it was all part of the same, for lack of a better word, brain fart, the rabbis say the penalty is just one sin offering. And I want to clarify here that for the rabbis, the idea of bringing a sin offering is actually an imagined or retrojected reality. The rabbis presided in their teaching of communities at a time principally after the temple had been destroyed, the priesthood had basically been dismantled as anything more than a ritual function in Jewish life, and the bringing of sacrifices was no longer a recognized or even permitted practice in Jewish life. It was basically made clear that so long as the temple lies in ruins, the Jewish people are not going to worship God through sacrifice. And so when the rabbis refer to all of these penalties, one might reasonably ask, well, what's the point here if people aren't actually bringing the sin offerings? The rabbis still want to make it clear that in a world or an idealized, retrojected world in which the temple were still standing, you would still be culpable for this momentary lapse in reason or judgment. However, you would be culpable for a fairly minor ritual penalty, bringing a sin offering, which would cover both the eating and the drinking at the same time. Not that this would ever actually have been carried out. So I think that what might be happening here is the rabbis merely wish to underscore that actions still have consequences, and that the fast of Yom Kippur is more than just a take it or leave it proposition. And so the rabbis frequently refer to offerings as that have to be presented as kind of penalties for forgetfulness, or as they say here, a lapse in judgment, a lapse in awareness, I think is the term as translated here, behe'elem echad, a lapse in awareness. But they didn't actually expect people to go and take a goat to some designated location, present it to a Kohen, and say, here's my penalty for waking up this morning and having Life cereal and orange juice, right? So a lot of what the rabbis are doing is imposing this kind of imagined layer from collective Jewish memory onto what was for them present-day Jewish practice. We'll read just to the end of this text. We'll take a couple questions. But I think that the surface meaning is fairly plain. Continuing, it says, however, if one ate and performed labor unwittingly. Now remember, in the text here, these are two separate sentences. It says, if a person and drank behe'elem, meaning in one lapse of awareness, he is obligated only to bring one sin offering. But if he ate and did work being the other restricted category of behaviors on Yom Kippur, chayav shetei chataot, he has to bring two sin offerings. And as Steinsaltz glosses here, as by doing so, he violated two separate prohibitions. So eating and drinking are really one, but doing work is the same as violating the Shabbat. It's the primary thing you're not supposed to do on Shabbat. And given that the Torah itself describes Yom Kippur as a Shabbat HaShabbaton, it is a great Sabbath, or it is a super Sabbath, all the more so should one not be violating the work restrictions for the Sabbath on Yom Kippur. Goes on to say, this is my favorite part of the text, if one ate foods that are not fit for eating or drank liquids that are not fit for drinking. And you might stop here and just say, well, what does that mean? Like motor oil? No, nothing that's going to poison you, but rather something like this. If, for instance, a person drank fish brine or the briny liquid in which fish are pickled. It sounds delicious, right? You open up a nice jar of matches herring and you enjoy the sweet liquor from the pickled herring juice. Who would do this? I have no idea. But such a person is exempt, meaning from any penalties, as this is not the typical manner of eating or drinking. In other words, if you are not doing something that is a typical way of nourishing yourself, then you're not violating Yom Kippur. And one might argue, though the rabbis do not, this rabbi does, that eating fish brine or drinking fish brine would be punishment enough. Like that is an affliction of the body, right? So if I wake up on Yom Kippur and say, I think I'll help myself to a delicious warm glass of pickled herring juice, the rabbis have no problem with that because that's a weird behavior. They might say, you've got a problem, Blake, but they don't have a problem with the act. Okay, any questions or comments on what the Babylonian Talmud begins to teach us about the fast of Yom Kippur? Thoughts, questions, comments? All right, Mom and Dad, you've got the first pass.
Mom wants to know if drinking a cup of black coffee can count as fish juice.
No.
No.
No, it can't. And even though your doctor may say that drinking a cup of black coffee is an acceptable fast for a colonoscopy, not a colonoscopy, but like if you're having labs done, if you're having blood work done, usually your doctor will say, yeah, but coffee is fine. Sorry, your doctor isn't your rabbi. In this case, the rabbi's authority exceeds the doctor's. I'm going to stop while I'm ahead. Okay, Susan Esther.
You mentioned that scapegoat is a positive thing. The goat escapes. But in this day and age, when you're a scapegoat, it's a negative connotation. So when did something positive, freedom, become something confining and negative?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer when the meaning of scapegoat was transformed or transferred in the cultural awareness, the larger cultural awareness from this ritual act of taking an actual goat, conferring upon it all the sins of the community and sending it off to die, thereby taking the sins with it and alleviating the community of its burden of sin, to what it is today, which is a general inclusive term, meaning one or a group that is blamed for the misfortune of others. I do not know when that happened. It would make for an interesting etymological study, though. And I imagine that if you just look up scapegoat etymology, it will probably tell you when it passed into the English language as a term referring not to the Levitical ritual directly, but to, again, a person or a group of people who take on blame for the misfortunes of others. Good question, though. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So we're going to look at the very next text, which is also about fasting. And the next text in our syllabus, I want to make sure I'm following correctly, is Yoma 82a. So we're now going to skip to the next page of the Talmud, the next daf. We were on 81a. we turn the page, or if you're in a book, you probably have to turn several pages, and you will find this text there. Okay, so what we're looking at here is another Mishnah. So we've done Mishnah, and then what followed on the previous page is some Gemara, some later interpretive rabbinic literature on the fast. And now we get to some more specific regulations around the fast that I thought were just so illuminating about how the Jewish mind thinks, right? How the rabbis think. Matane. So back to the Mishnah. Hatinokot ein me'anin otan b'yom hakippurim. We actually know most of these words. We know that matane means Mishnah. Hatinokot means little kids, children. Ein me'anin otan. Me'anin is the same root that we looked at in the passage from Leviticus 16. So going back to the Torah, when it says to afflict or practice self-deprivation or self-denial of the body, that's the word, that's the verb. You don't afflict otan, meaning them, meaning little kids, b'yom hakippurim. You don't afflict kids on Yom Kippur, meaning you do not impose upon children the same ritual restrictions or self-deprivations that are the categories that we discussed just a few moments ago. Aval, which means but, however, mechanechin otan. Nevertheless, you still have to train them. And this is a great word here, mechanechin. If I look at the root of this word, chet nun kaf, a holiday is hiding inside of that word. Does anyone know what holiday has Chanuk in it? Yeah, it's Hanukkah. Chanukah is a word that comes from the same root. It means dedication. So you dedicate a child in these ways, or it is also the word that means education. So to dedicate, to educate are the same root in Hebrew. Let me shrink that back down. So even though it is not Jewish practice to afflict a child with the ritual deprivations associated with Yom Kippur, it is appropriate and in fact recommended or required that you train a child, you dedicate a child to this practice. Mechanechin otan lifnei shana, before 1 year, v'lifnei shnatayim, or 2 years, bishvil sheyihiyu regilin b'mitzvot, so that it will become customary to do the mitzvot, as they translate here. You train them 1 year before 2 years, 1 year or 2 years before, and Steinsaltz helps us, they reach majority. We're going to talk about what that means, by means of a partial fast lasting several hours, so that they will be accustomed to fulfill mitzvot. So what is the age of majority in Jewish tradition? I see some of you mouthing it, even without unmuting. 13. Right. And would anyone like to be even more nuanced in your response to that question? What is the age of majority in the Jewish tradition? It is 13.
12,
Okay.
12 for a girl.
Girl.
Or 12
yes.
for a girl. And so that I assume that for many of us is common knowledge. Did anyone here celebrate bat mitzvah at 12 and not 13? Yeah, Cantor Kleinman raises her hand. So that is standard practice in many parts of the Jewish world, particularly today's conservative movement or in modern Orthodox congregations that practice bat mitzvah. That girls observe at 12, boys at 13, because the rabbis in antiquity were very clear that the age of majority is 13 for boys, 12 for girls. They even get more specific and say, not only is it about chronological age, it's about physical pubescence. You need simanim or signs that a child has entered puberty. So secondary sex characteristics, especially the development of hair, is usually regarded as the kind of green light to authorize that a child has reached the age of maturity or majority in the Jewish tradition. So this text is telling us that even though you don't make little kids fast, beginning a year or perhaps even 2 years before the age of bar bat mitzvah, you introduce them to the custom of fasting. Steve Kessler, comment or question here, please.
This review of Talmud discussion of rituals during the days of war, to me, raised some basic questions. What are the rabbis trying to say, or what should be our learning be? What's the purpose or meaning of ritual? Is it that the rituals themselves have religious significance, or is it the goal and the intentionality of following the rituals what's really more important? So that if the rituals are meant to help guide you individually, collectively, to be more observant and get into the mood of truly observing days of war, is that more important, or is there really some significance in a particular ritual?
Thank you for raising this question. I think the question itself actually merits just hanging in the air of our conversation and letting us marinate on exactly what you're asking. Particularly, I think you're demonstrating a recollection or an awareness of what we talked about just a week or two ago when we were talking about blowing shofar, right? What is the essence or the purpose of the ritual behaviors associated with, in this case, Rosh Hashanah, when we blow shofar so many times? And there we saw that the rabbis are acutely focused on the question of intentionality and not merely the doing of it in the proper way with the right kind of kosher instrument, all of which is important to the rabbis. But the discussion that we focused on was based on Talmudic teachings where the rabbis suggest that it's also about the intention that, in particular, not the one blowing shofar brings to the enterprise, but rather the one listening to it. It's also very meaningful for me because I'm like looking at my shofar right here. It's about 10 feet behind me, but I'm having this conversation with the symbol of the holidays right behind me. So is it enough that you just hear it and not pay attention? Right? Do you not have to internalize the meaning of the sound in order for the mitzvah truly to be fulfilled? One could take exactly the same set of questions or contemplations and map it onto this discussion about the fast. Right? Is it enough that you're just going through the fast? Anyone who's familiar with the Yontiv Haftarah on Yom Kippur from the book of Isaiah may recall its most celebrated line, "Is this the fast I desire?" Or "Is this the fast I am looking for?" The prophet speaking for God, bowing one's head like a reed, covering oneself in sackcloth and ashes, and on and on and on, where the prophet seems to be decrying ritual without intention. And then goes on to say, "Is not the fast I desire this, to unshackle the fetters of the bound and to set free every person who is in bondage," and on and on. So much more about spiritual liberation than physical self-deprivation through the ritual act of depriving oneself of food. And so that's why I think it is entirely consonant with rabbinic teaching to instruct a congregation or to enter a state of mindful awareness before we ourselves fast, including we clergy who fast, to say, well, what's the point of all of this? Am I doing it just so I can suffer? Or am I doing it for some higher purpose, which could include, among other possibilities, empathy for people who go without 3 good square meals a day? Or the idea that for one day of the year, we concentrate on something other than stuffing our bodies and making ourselves, and responding to our physical appetites, but instead recognize that there's more to life than just sustenance. I mean, there are 100 different possible meanings for the fast, each of which requires that a person approaches the ritual with some kind of deeper intentionality. So that's what I wanted to say. And we can say more about this, but I'd like to pause here and hand over the microphone, as it were, to Cantor Kleinman. And I realize in order to do that, I have to make you a co-host of the session, which I normally do from the very get-go. So now you have the ability to share text and whatnot from your screen.
Thank you. So Rabbi Blake helped guide us through texts that show the seriousness with which the Jewish tradition treats the obligation to fast on Yom Kippur. But the next texts that we're going to look at together are going to be part 2 of the PSA that Rabbi Blake offered a little bit earlier in our session today. And as those of you who attend high holiday services on Yom Kippur at WRT know, every year Rabbi Blake announces from the Bima that your health and safety take priority over fasting. And so he implores all of us not to fast if there is any medical reason that we should not do so. So we're going to look now at just a few of the texts in the Talmud that introduce this idea that our lives and our health take precedence over fasting. So I'm going to share my screen here, but I accidentally pressed the podcast button. I don't know how it is by the third session that I'm at with all of you. I'm still not able to share my screen with the same ease that Rabbi Blake is. So we're going to look, we're on Yoma 82a, and this is a Mishnah on that daf on that page. And this is a Mishnah that talks about the ins and outs of the obligations of a woman who is pregnant to fast. So the Mishnah begins, Ubara shehericha. So literally means a pregnant woman who smells something. Ma'achilin ota ad shetashiv nafsha. We feed her until tashiv nafsha, until her nefesh returns. And I'm purposely saying nefesh here because Rabbi Blake just showed us the biblical text that told us ta'anu et nafshotechem, you should inflict, and then nefesh in the biblical sense means body, and nefesh in the rabbinic sense means the soul. And I think that that's sort of an interesting question and distinction that's being made here in the Mishnah, and one that's not necessarily totally clear. So I'm going to read the sentence again. Ubara shehericha, pregnant woman who smells something. Ma'achilin ota ad shetashiv nafsha. So when we say a pregnant woman who smells something, what do we mean? If we look at the Steinsaltz translation here, we say, with regard to a pregnant person who smelled food and was overcome by a craving to eat it, one feeds her until she recovers. So it's actually a little bit unclear here whether what we're talking about is like she smells something and has some sort of a craving for it, or whether she smells something which reminds her of a hunger that's so very deep that we worry it might be dangerous for the pregnant person, it might be dangerous for the fetus, and therefore we feed her until she recovers. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that generally in rabbinic text, the word nefesh actually means the soul, not the body. So are we talking about until a person's soul recovers, or in other words, until their craving is satisfied? Or are we talking about in the biblical sense, until a person's body recovers? So a little bit unclear here. And Rashi has one interpretation that I think it would just be interesting to look at together. Rashi says, it was taught in the Mishnah, a pregnant woman who smells actually means the fetus smells the smell of the broth and craves it. And if she doesn't eat, the two of them are in danger. So it's sort of an open question, interesting interpretation. Are we talking about a situation where the actual health of a pregnant woman is at stake, or are we talking about a situation where she just really is craving something? And even though it's Yom Kippur, we take this person's needs, so seriously that we offer her food. So that's a question. Choleh, in the case of a person who is sick, ma'achilin oto al pi beki'in. So in the case of a person who is sick, we feed that person al pi beki'in, according to the advice of the experts, which would mean here like a medical professionals or a doctor. Ve'im ein sham beki'in, if there are no medical professionals present, ma'achilin oto al pi atzmo ad sheyomar dai. If there are no medical professionals present, then we feed the sick person according to their own judgment until they say, I've had enough. Okay, so we have the situation here of a pregnant woman where if she so much as smells food and says that she, wants something to eat, we feed her until she feels better. And then in the case of somebody who's sick, we would first rely on the guidance of some sort of an expert. And if there were not an expert available, we would rely on the judgment of the person who was sick to say, I need some food. And then we would offer that person some food. We're going to look at a second text now, and then we're going to return to kind of talk about some big ideas of both of them. But we're going to turn now to Yoma 83a. Hold on. actually access this other text from our syllabus. Rabbi Blake, are you just able to pull up this text easily? Because I'm having to try to now move.
Sure. What do
Thank
we
you.
want? 83A.
No, it's okay. Actually, I got it now.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Remember when we had books? Okay.
Remember the past decade where I still haven't figured out how to use technology properly. Okay.
It's all good.
So now we're going to read a text that sort of expands on what we've been looking at so far. And this is sort of still commenting on the Mishnah that we just read. Choleh ma'achilin oto al pi b'ki'in. So we just read about this. A sick person, we feed him according to the wisdom or according to the words of the experts. Amar Rabbi Yanai says, Choleh omer tzarich, v'rofeh omer eino tzarich, shom'in lacholeh. So Rabbi Yanai sets up the situation where the sick person says, I need food. But the doctor says, he doesn't really need food, he just thinks he needs food. And so the question is, what do we do here? Are we relying on the guidance of the experts, or are we relying on the guidance of the person who's sick who says they need food? And the Talmud tells us, Shom'in lacholeh. In that case, we listen to the person who is sick, and that person's feeling and judgment overrides the judgment of the medical expert. Ma'itama, what is the reason that we would say that the judgment of the person who's sick overrides the judgment of the expert? And we're quoting here from the book of Proverbs. Lev yodea marat nafsho. The heart knows the bitterness of its soul. Or in other words, a person's own heart understands its soul better than anybody else. Or again, in other words, you know yourself better than anyone else knows you. And so if you say that you're sick and you need something to eat, even if others may disagree with you, we give you something to eat. So the Talmud continues, Pshita. Okay, that's obvious. We know you know yourself better than anybody else. Why are you bringing that text to us? Mahu detema, the Talmud answers, what would you have supposed? Or in other words, you might have supposed, if we didn't tell you that, Rofe kim le tepe, kamashmalan. So the Talmud is saying, had we not brought you that text, you might have supposed that the doctor is more certain, or in other words, that the doctor is more certain than you are what your medical needs would be, and therefore we need to rely upon the guidance of the doctor. And so the Talmud specifically wants to tell us in this case, no, in fact, if you say you need something to eat, then you should certainly have something to eat. And so these texts are very interesting because they are, in fact, not exactly how this issue plays out in traditional Judaism, and particularly in Orthodox and certain conservative settings as well. Our Talmudic texts are actually very clear that, first of all, if a pregnant person so much as craves food, that she should be given something to eat, and clear as well that if a person who is sick says, I need something to eat, we give them food until they feel better, and that's it. Actually, within the Jewish tradition and within the way that contemporary halacha, Jewish law, has played out, it becomes a little bit more nuanced than that, which partially relates to some of the texts that Rabbi Blake shared with us before about the different kinds of sin offerings that a person is liable for having broken the fast of Yom Kippur. And that's because there is a rabbinic idea that there's a certain amount of food that is required for a person to eat for it to actually be considered food. It depends on what rabbinic text you're looking at, but some say it's about the size of an olive, or some say it's about the size of a date. But there's this idea that if you've eaten less food than that, it doesn't necessarily count as food. You may or may not know as well, there's an interesting rabbinic idea that if you're cooking up pot of soup and say, for instance, that it's meat soup, and accidentally a splash of milk lands in the soup, if the amount of milk that lands in the soup is less than 1/60th of the volume of the whole soup, it doesn't actually count that it was in there, because it's not enough to change the character or change the nature of the soup that you made. So the way that this has actually played out has been an encouragement for people who are able to consider an idea that's called shiurim in the Jewish tradition, which is the idea that you consume very small amounts of food at frequent intervals throughout the course of the day, so that you remain healthy, but that nothing that you're eating at any given time is enough for the rabbis to really consider it as though you've broken the fast of Yom Kippur. And I want to make very clear, though, that in all streams of Judaism, if a person's health or well-being is at stake, any amount of food that is required for a person to remain healthy is acceptable. But I just thought it was important to note and to point out that even though our tradition is very clear in making a person's life and health the priority, that our rabbis have sort of continued to imagine whether there are ways to continue to have the intention of honoring the fast of Yom Kippur, even if one is not able to. Any questions, comments, thoughts on what we've just read? Steve?
Yeah, I'm assuming that the reference of bringing the expert or the medical expert into the equation at all is that if there were a dispute, the person doesn't think they need anything and the doctor says they do, that the doctor then prevails, because otherwise what's the point of bringing the reference in?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Right. So in the case that a person says they don't need food, but the doctor says that they do, then the doctor would be overriding, the person who's sick. But I love this idea and this precedent within the Jewish tradition as well, that we give honor and agency to the choice of the individual, in this case, when the doctor says that they don't need food. So it's really designed both to protect somebody and to give them, agency in protecting their own lives and their own health. Norm?
Is there any minimum amount of water or liquid?
So the concept of shiurim that I was just talking about for food applies to liquid as well. And there's a specific rabbinic amount. And I don't know if Rabbi Blake knows exactly what it is, but it's like some number of tablespoons at a time.
Yeah, I don't know.
That many people who aren't necessarily in anyone who's in a life-threatening situation or a health-threatening situation should consume the volume of food or liquid that they need to. But people who are concerned going into a fast that perhaps it could be problematic for them will often drink that volume of liquid and consume that volume of food at regular intervals throughout the day.
It's a scant amount, in other words.
Yes.
Judy Lass, is that a hand up?
Yes.
Great.
There's a hand up. I just wanted to say that this is a part of Yom Kippur that's always fascinated me because I was free. I've always fasted, and then I was told that I needed not to fast. And it's very significant because it's a very hard thing to do. Even with the directive that has come in the Yoma 82, whatever. And I think that one of the things that has always made me feel very proud about being a Jewish person, I mean, just proud in general to be a person, is that the rabbis took into consideration. Ritual is so important, so important, so important, but as you said, life is more important, and it's a very strong precept, I believe, in Judaism, where you do not have to sacrifice yourself to feel like you're a good person.
Thank you.
Technically, it's not good for your health. So thank you very much, folks.
Absolutely. And on Yom Kippur morning, by the way, in the Torah, in our Torah reading, you know, we read the words uvacharta v'chaim, that you must choose life. So certainly, you know, certainly that Torah reading would be inconsistent with, you know, any kind of perspective that would encourage a person to, you know, put their health or safety at risk through fasting.
But don't let anyone disparage a clergy person or any other person in the community telling you that it's okay not to fast if it's medically counterindicated, because it's not some reform thing. Now you've seen it. You've seen it straight from the sources. Mom and Dad.
I think it's also very touching that both the Gemara and Rashi commenting on it take the consideration of the unborn, the child in utero, and say, you know, with the clear postulate that it's not just you're feeding. So if you are hungry, it's almost like an imperative. We have to feed you because it ain't just you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure that there are a number of people right here on this class who have experienced pregnancy during Yom Kippur and have had to grapple with exactly this issue. So I don't know if anyone who pregnant has ever craved drinking fish brine. I know that there are sometimes some strange cravings associated with it. And anyway, okay. So we're going to switch both years, topics, and pages of Talmud. We're going to jump ahead a few more pages in Tractate Yoma to return to the master theme of the days of awe, Teshuvah. And that will take us close to the end of our session, but we may have time to look at a little bonus text. If not, bonus means you get to look at it on your own. But let's now proceed to the next segment of our learning, which is Tractate Yoma 86b. And we're going to begin with a teaching by Rabbi Yochanan, who says, so Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Gidola Teshuvah, great is Teshuvah, Shidocha et lo ta'aseh shebatorah. So Teshuvah is big or great, Shidocha et lo ta'aseh shebatorah, in that it overrides, docha is the verb to override or push aside, cancel out, et lo ta'aseh shebatorah, a negative commandment in the Torah, or a prohibition. So a lo ta'aseh, mitzvot, or commandments in the Jewish tradition, can fall into one of two basic categories. They're mitzvot aseh, which are positive mitzvot, which are requirements, and there are mitzvot lo ta'aseh, negative mitzvot, thou shalt nots, prohibitions, right? So thou shalt not commit adultery, which is the one we're specifically going to look at, is a negative prohibition, whereas I'm trying to think of a positive mitzvah, give tzedakah, right? Give tzedakah is a positive mitzvah, something you have to do. Lo ta'aseh means mitzvot that you must not do. By the way, just as a fun aside, all Jewish people are responsible for upholding all of the negative mitzvot, both men and women. Men only are responsible for the positive mitzvot, save for 3 that are related to Shabbat. It is actually incumbent on women, according to rabbinic tradition, to set up the Eruv, to take the challah offering out of the bread that's being prepared, out of the dough, and to light the Shabbat candles. So those are traditionally associated with the female head of household, whereas the male head of household is responsible for all the other positive mitzvot, like learning Torah and performing all of the ritual commandments and tithing and what have you. So now we're going to look at the conjecture or the postulate that Rabbi Yochanan puts forward, which is that Teshuvah is so great because it even can override a negative commandment. And we know that negative commandments are hard and fast, right? There's never, asterisk, there's never really a reason why a person would be exempt from a thou shalt not. thou shalt nots are applicable at all times. Except Rabbi Yochanan cleverly is going to say, but there is one example where Teshuvah is even greater than a negative commandment. So what is Rabbi Yochanan getting at? It's an absolutely brilliant drush here. And we're really getting into, I think, some of the deeper spiritual waters of what the High Holy Days are really all about. So, Shene'emar, as it is written, Lemor hein yishalach ish et ishto, the halacha meito v'haita le'ish acher, hayashuv elecha od, halo chanof techenaf haaretz hachi, ve'at zanit re'im rabim v'shov elai ne'um Adonai. What does all of this mean? Here's the text. As it is stated, God said, if a man sends away his wife, and she goes from him and becomes another man's. So he says to his wife, I'm done with you, I've had it, you are hereby released or divorced. Sorry, I don't know what's happening in my sidebar there. That should go away. May he return to her again. In other words, if you send away your wife but just want to come back after she has consorted with another man, will not that land be greatly polluted? In other words, she's gone without a proper get or with any of the other required stipulations for divorce. This isn't actually a divorce. This is just be gone. And she goes and shacks up with another guy. And now the idea is, can he take her back? Will not that land be greatly polluted by fornication and adultery? And here's the text. But you have committed adultery with many lovers, and would you yet return to me, said the Lord. From Jeremiah 3:1. So what's going on here? Before we look at Steinsaltz, which I think gives too much away and does not allow us to exercise our own intelligence and ingenuity in figuring out what's happening here. So basically, I'll summarize. Rabbi Yochanan proposes that Teshuvah is incredible. It's great because it overrides even what the Torah says about adultery, which is one of the categorical thou shalt nots of Jewish life, right? We know it because it's in the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. And the case is set up of, so suppose a man and a woman, they split up, or he says, I don't like you anymore. She goes, she shacks up with another fellow, she has sex, and then the man says, oh man, did I really screw up here? I really regret getting rid of my love. I want her back. And he takes her back. And the question that is asked in the text being cited here is, well, wait a minute, isn't that a problem? Because she's already defiled herself with other men. She's already committed adultery because she hasn't been legitimately dismissed from the marriage, merely dismissed from her husband's presence. But Jeremiah, the prophet who speaks the text that's being quoted here in the Talmud, says God's response is, hey, I do this all the time. What's indicated here? Let's take some guesses. Arlene, you're first.
Well, one of the things that I'm disturbed about is in biblical times, people were not just having one marriage, they were having many different relationships. So how is that applicable here in this text?
It is true that the Bible presents polygamous marriage as a fact of life. And yet at the same time, even in a polygamous union, even in the case of a Jacob who marries both a Leah and a Rachel in that order.
And Abraham
who has both Sarah, his full wife, and Hagar, his concubine, who functionally is his wife and the mother of his first child, Ishmael. Even though this is a norm presented throughout biblical literature, it is nevertheless incumbent on the woman not to break faith with her husband. Adultery in the biblical mindset is only on the woman in a marriage. I know that is itself, I'm not solving the problem, or if I am, I'm solving it by creating another one. So let's not impose 21st century American Jewish mores on a 21st century BCE text. Having said that, your discomfort is duly noted.
Okay.
Mom and Dad, so what's happening in the text here? And how is God saying, hey, I know what this is like. I tolerate this kind of thing all the time. Yeah.
Well, in this story, not to impose 21st century interpretation on it, the man is the stand-in for God. And the postulate here is, all the times you wanted to go back to Egypt, all of the times I had to tell you not to worship Canaanite gods, and you did anyway, all of the times you have disobeyed me, I still take you back, because, implied, that's part of the covenantal relationship here.
On the nose. Great. I will elaborate only to corroborate. So yes, this is the idea. It's to be read allegorically. God, of course, is not married, but God and the Jewish people are in a covenant that is sacred and bound through love, the same way the Jewish people, the same way a husband and wife are in a marital covenant. And the idea is that if God allows the Jewish people to break faith and still takes them back in love, which is a theme and phrase that now that you've heard it, you will not be able to unhear it during the high holidays. You will hear this idea come up many times, that despite our waywardness, our meaning the Jewish people's waywardness, despite the fact that we keep breaking faith with God, and not just in the biblical times, but time and time again, despite the way in which we deny God, reject God, break faith with God, worship anything but God, take that as you will, any number of ideals, things, iPhones, fame, fortune, celebrity, power, money, all the golden calves of today. Despite the fact that we, the Jewish people, keep doing this, God says, I'm going to take you back. And therefore, that proves Rabbi Yochanan's point that Teshuvah is a great precept of Jewish life, because it overrides even the restriction on adultery, where read allegorically, adultery is the same as idolatry. And adultery and idolatry are, in fact, flip sides of the same coin in Jewish thought. So much so that if you line up the 10 Commandments 5 and 5, the way they're usually presented figuratively on 2 drawn tablets, the commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, is looking mirror image opposite on the other tablet from thou shalt not commit adultery. And many rabbis have noted that the parallelism is both overt and intentional. Steve Maskett, Kathy, and then Trish, and then we'll move forward.
Two reactions. One was that it seemed like there's inherently a sense of that God rejects, because the man's rejecting, because that's what starts the process in this text. And so it's sort of like almost like an apology for needing to return, because somehow God must have rejected us, pushed us aside, in some way. Reading that in as well. And the other was, it wasn't clear to me who was doing the returning in this allegory.
That's great. I wonder if we could live with the ambiguity of that, because I'm not sure reading it that it is made clear. And I think that is actually consistent with the nature of Teshuvah, that at least Teshuvah as it is effected with an E in relationship, must be bidirectional. It must be somebody who approaches and somebody who receives. Teshuvah can't be made if the person who is seeking forgiveness is rebuffed 3 times, right? At that point, by the way, the one seeking forgiveness has been released of the obligation to do Teshuvah with another person. So if I know that I've hurt Arlene and I approach Arlene earnestly and do Teshuvah, I've not just repented, but I've changed my ways, and I approach Arlene and she says, I'm not ready to forgive you. And she does this 3 times, says, I can't forgive you for what you've done. Unfortunately, the Teshuvah cannot be effectuated, but the person seeking forgiveness is released of the obligation to do Teshuvah. Right? There's no more I can do. And this is where the sadness of estranged relationships really can be felt. And I don't need to elaborate on that, because I imagine that every single person here, either directly or indirectly, has experienced and may even presently experiences the pain of a relationship that has reached the point beyond which Teshuvah cannot be made anymore. And then, by the way, the rabbis would say the gates of Teshuvah are still always open. They never close. Even after Ne'ilah, the final service on Yom Kippur, even after Hoshana Rabbah, the very last day of the Sukkot harvest season, when you can petition God again, the gates of repentance, the gates of Teshuvah don't actually ever close for a sincere person. Kathy Shinehouse, unmute yourself first.
There we go.
Yep.
Okay, so the sexual drive is the strongest of all the drives that God gives us. And even when we are punished, typically we're not punished by God, we're punished by man. And we're sent, women who are raped in the town circle or assumed to be raped in the town circle are sent out to the edges of the town to be, slaughtered with their rapists. So God's not doing the punishing particularly, and I think he understands what's been created through these energies, and
there's something
that's the ride.
I hadn't thought of it beforehand, Kathy, but your comment evokes for me a parallelism that could be drawn between the restriction of fasting and the way in which Teshuvah is to override even adultery in this passage, only because they both have to do with the, excuse me. I'm allergic to the fish brine I drank this morning. They're both about the curbing of appetite, and yet, as we've seen through the text, a nuanced recognition that in many ways we are still driven by our cravings. So thank you for that, Kathy.
I mean, you can go 3 weeks without eating. You can go longer without, sex, probably, but it will hurt you mentally more than 3 weeks without eating will hurt you physically.
So the recognition of what it means to be a human being and that we are not God is also, I think, at the heart of how the rabbis frame the enterprise of Teshuvah. As we said last week, Teshuvah, not about self-flagellation or wallowing in self-guilt and disdain, self-pity, martyring ourselves on the altar of Jewish guilt, but rather Teshuvah as the ongoing mindful process of self-creation, self-improvement, self-awareness, and growth. These are the things that I think the rabbis are driving at in these texts. We're going to look at just one other from this, and then I'm going to hand back to my colleague. So there's a whole set of parallel premises in the following sugyot or passages from Tractate Yoma 86b, all beginning with the premise, Gedolat Teshuvah. Teshuvah is great because. And this first one was my favorite in the set because it overrides even the negative transgression of adultery. But there are plenty of others which are really interesting. Like if you're looking just for fun, great is repentance, which lengthens the years of a person's life. Or great is repentance as the penitent's intentional sins are counted for him as unwitting transgressions. In other words, Teshuvah can actually soften even premeditated deeds in the judgment of God. But the last one I wanted to look at just briefly, without a whole lot of commentary, is number 7, which comes from a Baraita, Tanya, meaning a parallel Mishnaic era teaching. A Baraita, Hayav Rabbi Meir Omer. Rabbi Meir said, Gedolah Teshuvah. So a different rabbi, but the same formula. Why is Teshuvah great? Shebishvil yachid she'asa teshuvah mochalin l'chol ha'olam kulo. So translated here, because the entire world is forgiven on account of one individual who repents. Which, this is an astonishing statement. Let's see how they proof text it. As it is stated in the book of Hosea, another prophet who talks a lot, by the way, about adultery and idolatry as parallel constructs. God says in the prophet's mouth, I will heal their backsliding, I will love them freely, for my anger has turned away from him, the transgressor. And Hosea is a full book that derives from an analogy of a faithless wife, which of course, as my dad pointed out just a few moments ago, is an allegory for God and the Jewish people. The Jewish people is the faithless wife, God is God, God takes us back even after we stray. It does not say, the rabbis point out, from them, meaning God has turned anger away from all the sinners, but rather from him, meaning that individual. Because one repented, everyone is healed. I will heal their backsliding. I will love them freely. My anger has turned away from him. So the rabbis are playing with the difference in a single verse between the plural, which is the result, and the singular, which is the actor. The actor does teshuvah, one person, the whole people benefit. So this may speak to the bigger concept of, somebody pointed this out. I was teaching 11th and 12th grade last night. I had a couple of 12th graders who were sitting with me, and we were studying some of these texts, because why not? And this wonderful young woman, who happens to be a senior at Mamaroneck High School, where my nephew Samson just began this week, she said, I always wondered why we have to say all of the things where we pound our chests collectively, even if we personally didn't do them. So there is this wonderful dynamic that is being expressed through the communal teshuvah, that one acts, all are affected, right? So, and that there is no such thing as sins that are only private between a person and God, that is not deserving of being brought into shul and, as it were, shared in the presence of the entire Jewish community. It's a very powerful notion, that we are all responsible both for our own individual behaviors, but our individual teshuvah may have ripple effects that spread to the whole community. And the way it's phrased in the positive here, which I think is very heartening. So teshuvah is this great gift, but it operates on multiple levels, not just inside a person with one's private misdeeds and private teshuvah before God, but also at the community or even global level. Mom and Dad, you'll get the next comment, and then we'll pass back.
Right. This reminds me of our liturgy, which says, if you save one life, it's as though you've saved the whole world.
Beautiful. Right.
I think it's the same way of looking at things.
Yes, it is. And you might just substitute the word soul. If you save one soul, you've saved the soul of the entire world. Lovely. Just beautiful.
It also seems that this passage from Hosea would find comfort in the Gospels, because by extension, isn't the Christ who takes, all of the blame upon the world upon himself, and, makes atonement, I guess, through his death, saves the whole world. So it's maybe an extension or an elaboration, but it seems that in Christian theology, this kind of thing finds an anchor.
Yeah, without having studied the question sufficiently to provide a definitive answer, what I do believe is fair to say is that it is always appropriate to observe the ways in which rabbinic thought and rabbinic Judaism may well have been shaped by, or shaped, I would say, in dialogue with Christianity, because both rabbinic Judaism, that is to say Talmudic Judaism, and early Christianity are sibling traditions growing up at the same time. It isn't really the case that Judaism is the mother church out of which Christianity springs. It's not primarily a parent-child relationship between our two faiths. It is much more that there's a common stock, a common trunk, out of which two divergent branches emerge, rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, and they both are very much in dialogue with each other as they evolve. So the idea of what effectuates salvation is a core question for both. But in Christianity, of course, the mechanism of salvation is entirely or principally located in the figure of the Christ, whereas in rabbinic Judaism, the mechanism of salvation is teshuvah. It is in the dialogue between the human being another human being, the relationship between two people or multiple people, and between the people and God. And so it's a very different means to similar ends, which is how do we save ourselves from the constant burden of our own frailty and sin. Okay. Kathy, Susan, Esther, I want to make sure we get to the next text. We won't get to the bonus text today. That is okay. You can print it out and take it with you to shul. I will not be insulted if during some of the slower moments of services you pull it out and go, oh, that's the thing that Blake and Kleinman said would be fun to read during the high holidays. Okay, so briefly, Susan, Esther, and then Kathy.
Please forgive me if I'm misinterpreting, and I say with please forgive me in light of what we've been discussing, but it seems that repentance is such a simplistic way to view it, because I still hark to what I said last week, that there are some sins that can never be forgiven, no matter how much you beat your breast or how much you confess or how much you go. It has to be beyond the pale. And
well, there are some, because there are some things where the crime is so severe that merely saying I'm sorry, or even saying I'll never do it again, is insufficient to rectify the crime. And that, by the way, is why, even though the rabbis put severe restrictions on its implementation, there are extensive writings in the rabbinic literature, and of course, you know that this is present throughout the Hebrew Bible, that uphold the precept of capital punishment, right? There are some crimes for which, if blood is shed, then blood must be shed in return. And though the rabbis severely mitigate the implementation of capital and corporal punishment, they never deny its validity. So I think that speaks to your comment. Thank you. And Kathy.
Yeah, just a modernized interpretation that I hope you'll appreciate. I heard a story about a large group of people that were asked whether they knew, and raise their hand if they knew any racists, and hundreds and hundreds of people raised their hands when asked whether they knew racists, and then they lowered their hands, and then they were asked, how many of you are racists?
Hands. Right.
I mean, whether it was peer pressure or something else, but you know, I was thinking about the chest pounding and the need to affiliate and the need to de-affiliate, and you know, the peer pressure, and it's so anyhow, I had that association.
As a fellow music fan, Kathy, I'll quote you some of my favorite lyrics by Elvis Costello from a more obscure album in his early solo career. He said, one day you're going to have to face a deep, dark, truthful mirror, and it's going to tell you things that I still love you too much to say.
Yeah.
Cantor.
Yeah. Interesting. Good one.
Cantor, are you with us?
I'm with you. I was talking into, I was muted. The next texts on the syllabus, there are 3 of them, but I want to make sure that we have time for Rabbi Blake to wrap up our studying together. So I'd like to focus on just one of them.
Minutes to do that.
Would you? Okay. Okay. So I think we'll focus on just one of those 3 texts that has an ethical message in it that really resonates with me as I think about Teshuvah over these high holidays. I'd like us just very briefly to return to a Mishnah that we read last week, just as some background, because the Talmud text that we're looking at is actually continued conversation about that Mishnah. We're not going to read the entire thing, but we're going to focus on the second half that says, Ha'omer echeta ve'ashuv, echeta ve'ashuv. So the person who says, I will transgress and I will return, or I will repent or do teshuvah, I will transgress and I will do teshuvah, ein maspikin beyado la'asot teshuvah. that person is not given the opportunity to do teshuvah. So the person who says, I will transgress and I will repent, I will transgress and I will repent, is not given an opportunity to do teshuvah. So the text we're going to look at is continued conversation on that line. And it reads, Ha'omer echeta ve'ashuv, echeta ve'ashuv. The person who says, I will transgress and I will do teshuvah, I will transgress and I will do teshuvah. Lama li lemeimar echeta ve'ashuv, echeta ve'ashuv, tre zimne. So why is it that this text needs to say, I will transgress and do teshuvah, I will transgress and do teshuvah 2 times? Right? The text repeats that same phrase, echeta ve'ashuv, twice, and that seems extraneous. Ki de Rav Huna Amar Rav, and this is a construction we often see in the Talmud, and it means here, it is according to Rav Huna, who speaks in the name of Rav. And we often see this when you see Amar somebody else, it means somebody said, and what that actually means is that there's a particular sage who says in the name of another sage, or a sage who is calling to mind something that another sage said. De Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav, because Rav Huna says in the name of Rav. Rav is an early Amoraic sage who founded his own academy and is often in the Talmud referred to just as Rav. Kevan she'avar adam aveira v'shanaba. So when a person transgresses vishanaba and returns and does it again, hutralo, it is permitted to him. So we're quoting this idea that if a person goes back and performs the same transgression again, hutralo, somehow it becomes permitted to him. And so the Talmud is very taken aback by this idea, and they're saying hutralo salkadatach, which means it is permitted, and literally it means, would it arise on your mind? Another way to put it, or a way I like to put it, is, could you possibly be in your right mind to say something like that? That if a person just does the same transgression a second time, then actually that's something that becomes permitted to him? Ella, rather, the way to understand that is na'aseit lo keheter. So rather, what Rav Huna means, who's saying this in the name of Rav, is it becomes to him as if it is permitted. So the reason, in other words, that our Mishnah is saying twice the idea, I will transgress and I will do teshuvah, is because, and I think we can all identify with this, I think we've all had the experience where the first time we do something we know we're not going to be proud of, we really, really, really agonize over it. And then when an opportunity arises to do the same thing again, it's not so hard the second time or the third time. And so all of a sudden, it becomes as though those transgressions are permitted to us. We no longer internalize in the same way that this is actually a way that we don't want to be behaving. And I really love that message as we approach the high holiday season, because I think it's an invitation for us to, in our own process of teshuvah, to dig deeply not only into those things that we know we're not proud of, but to dig into those things that have become habits for us that we knew the first time or things that we didn't want to do, but then as we became habituated, or they became sort of routines in our lives, sort of lost, we lost that sense that those were ways that we didn't want to be acting or didn't want to be behaving. Steve.
I'm glad you raised this, because I think it's good to remind ourselves what are the ultimate goals that we're trying to achieve here as a people. And that if we're trying to encourage each of us individually and collectively to try to live a meaningful, purposeful life according to Torah, one, if you're the person that we all have failings, and if you look at the selection of Jacob as one of our patriarchs, I think that's such a great blessing and wisdom to us that God recognized we all have imperfections and failings. And so if you're the person who's been failing, but if you can, there's still always an opening. God's blessing us to try to strive once again. But if you're a member of society, you should be, don't rush to judge someone harshly if they're failing right now. I mean, if they're repeating some of it, that we all have faults, and we shouldn't think, oh, well, then they're really not capable of forgiveness or some divine redemption. I think it's important for us to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. It's funny. I was actually having a conversation with somebody yesterday who said, I'm finding myself doing this same action again and again and again. And isn't the point of Teshuvah that we're supposed to find ourselves in the same situation the second time and not do it again? And I said, I think sometimes that's what we take from our tradition, but that's not what I take from the idea of Teshuvah, because if we truly believed that it were fully in our power to just not do something the second time, we wouldn't need to have Yom Kippur every year, right? And so, I agree with you that that's why our tradition gives us this opportunity every single year, because there is a recognition that it is very human to fall back into those patterns again, and that every year we need that opportunity to reevaluate. Okay, who is owner?
Kathy. Oh, unmute.
Oh, Kathy, you're muted.
We wouldn't need it for the same old Teshuvah, but that fails to acknowledge our imagination to create new ways of screwing up.
Yeah.
Yep.
Indeed. Some of you may also recall that last Rosh Hashanah, on the second day in our sermon / in study, which is usually the way we learn and pray and worship together on the second day of Rosh Hashanah at WRT, I presented a Hasidic teaching about the building of the tabernacle, which was the portable tent where the Israelites met their God and worshiped and encountered the divine in their wilderness journey. And the whole point of the tabernacle is because it was portable and because the Israelites were a traveling community, they had to erect it and then dismantle it and move forward, and erect it and dismantle it and move forward. And the Rav who teaches this text, and whose name I don't want to misquote, I think it's the Slonimer Rebbe from Slonim, Poland, early 20th century, late 19th century. He says, this is a metaphor for Teshuvah. This is what we all have to do. Each one of us is like the ancient tabernacle. And even if we think that we are fully built and ready to receive God's presence, actually the thing we have to do is dismantle it and rebuild. It's a lovely, it's a beautiful text. Linda Markowitz.
I think that covers my question about what about people that think that they're perfect.
That in and of itself, thinking that proves that you're not.
Right.
Right.
Can we turn it back over to you to...
Okay, I'll take that. Any other comments or questions? I want to share a final reflection. First of all, the bonus text. You'll see in the syllabus, which I'll be sure to distribute again, it's in some of the emails, though, that have been sent around from the office, is from a parallel text, in other words, written around the same time as the early Talmudic period, late Mishnaic period, called Seder Olam Rabbah. So it's a midrash that maps the entire High Holy Day chronology from leading up to Rosh Hashanah through the 10 days of Teshuvah to the Day of Atonement, against the story of Moses going up Mount Sinai, receiving the tablets of the law from God, being ready to give them to the people, discovering that the people have transgressed with the golden calf, smashing the tablets, going back up Mount Sinai, and writing a new set of tablets. It turns that entire narrative from chapters 32 to 34 of the book of Exodus into a meta commentary on the human process or the Jewish process of Teshuvah through the high holy days. And it basically says the day that Moses went down the mountain was Yom Kippur. And so you can see the way in which this story of receiving the law, receiving the divine presence, breaking faith, coming back, renewing the covenant, all map against the norms of Teshuvah and the time of year that we're about to enter. So I'll share that with you as a little bit of a treat for you to contemplate during the days of awe, which, in case you don't have it on your calendars, begins a week from tomorrow night with sundown on Shabbat. What a meaningful privilege it has been to learn with all of you. For me, I just want to give a very special acknowledgement and shout out to my friend and colleague, Cantor Kleinman, who now everyone knows is a brilliant Talmudist as well, and will continue to share her learning and wisdom and insights into these texts with the community in forthcoming teaching. So pay attention, as will I, sometimes individually, sometimes together. We've already agreed, I think, without saying as much, that our team teaching these last few weeks has been proof of concept for us. So that's been really, really nice. And then, of course, as I always say, to learn in community with all of you is just the sweetest gift, and has already added a little bit of a taste of apples and honey to the flavors of the new year. So I hope that this learning has been enlightening, nourishing, intriguing, and has left you, as always, with more questions than answers, questions that you will continue to chew on, even if you're not chewing on any food, through the Day of Atonement. So we'll wish you a Shanah Tovah Umituka. May your year be renewed, blessed, and sweet. And we will look forward to seeing all of you either in person or knowing that you're with us online during the High Holy Days. L'Shana Tovah.
Rabbi, Cantor.
Not Tovah. Doug and Marge, nice seeing you again.
Good to see everybody too. Shanah Tovah, Joe.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for adding to what wonderful things that I hope to continue to learn. Healthy Shanah Tovah.
Shanah Tovah.
Right. Shanah Tovah.
Shanah Tovah.
Shanah.